True power does not lie in winning arguments, but in mastering oneself and guiding interactions strategically. Have you ever tried to convince someone with logical arguments, but instead of winning the discussion, you realized that the person became even more resistant? This is a common problem. We argue thinking that reason will prevail, but reality is different. The more we try to prove a point, the more the other person clings to their own idea. In the end, no one wins. They just get worn out. Most discussions are not about seeking the truth, but about feeding the ego. People enter debates driven by a desire for validation, not by a genuine interest in learning, and this creates a toxic cycle. You argue, the other counters, the conversation heats up, and the initial goal gets lost in the heat of the moment. We forget what really matters. It's not the logic of the argument, but the way emotions shape our perception of reality. Inspired by Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy of the pursuit of power, this video explores how silence can be applied in everyday life to transform the way we interact and influence others. Friedrich Nietzsche saw power not as the ability to impose ideas by force, but as the ability to control oneself and thereby influence others. Instead of reacting impulsively, the true strategist chooses when to speak and when to remain silent. That's what we are going to explore, how silence is often stronger than any words. Arguing seems to be the natural way to prove a point, but the truth is that most heated conversations do not lead to real change. The reason? The human brain is not programmed to accept arguments that challenge its beliefs. On the contrary, when someone feels their ideas are being attacked, the instinct is to defend, not reflect. This happens because of what psychologists call the confirmation bias. Instead of rationally analyzing the information, we tend to look for evidence that reinforces what we already believe. That is to say, the more you try to defeat someone in an argument, the more that person clings to their own opinion. The result is that, instead of convincing, you create resistance. Another common mistake is confusing debate with social validation. Many people enter discussions not because they want to learn something new, but because they want to prove they are right. When the goal is not knowledge, but the desire to come out victorious, any conversation becomes a battle of egos. If you find yourself arguing to reaffirm your position, you are falling right into that trap. Moreover, emotional reactivity weakens any position the moment you lose control and start responding in the heat of the moment. You've already lost because the one who reacts is being manipulated by the environment, while the one who maintains silence controls the dynamics of the conversation. Most fights are not won with arguments, but with presence and posture. Nietzsche argued that true power is not in rebutting every provocation, but in mastering one's own reactions. It is this idea that leads us to the next point: how the philosophy of strategic silence can transform your influence in any situation. Friedrich Nietzsche understood power differently. For most people, true mastery wasn't about brute force or imposing ideas, but the ability to influence reality without being a slave to one's emotions. His concept of the will to power was not just about dominating others, but primarily about dominating oneself. At the center of this thinking is the figure of the Übermensch, the Superman, someone who transcends their instinctive reactions and acts strategically. They don't get irritated by provocations, don't waste energy trying to prove a point, and don't react automatically to external stimuli. They observe, reflect, and choose when and how to express themselves. This idea is directly connected to the power of strategic silence. For Nietzsche, silence was not synonymous with passivity, but a powerful tool of control. The one who masters silence commands respect without needing to wear themselves out. Instead of falling into the trap of emotional debates, they create tension and force the other to reveal themselves. Silence has a profound psychological effect. When someone expects a response and only receives a pause, uncertainty begins to erode their confidence. The human mind hates emptiness, and in the face of silence, it fills that space with doubts and interpretations. This is the secret of strategic silence. Instead of reacting to every provocation, you allow the other person to get lost in their own insecurity. Nietzsche believed that most people were prisoners of their own emotions, and that true strength lay in controlling these automatic responses. In his words, "He who cannot command himself will always end up being commanded by someone." In the real world, we see this principle applied by leaders, strategists, and influencers who know that speaking less is often the path to conquering more. The idea that silence can be a tool of power is not just theoretical. It has been applied by some of the brightest minds in history, from philosophers and business strategists to legendary warriors. Many influential figures knew how to use silence to control interactions and win battles without needing to raise their voice. Socrates never needed to prove he was right. He simply asked questions. His method, known as the Socratic Maieutic, was a dialectical game of questions and answers, followed by more questions. He questioned, listened, and allowed the opponent to contradict themselves. This process, besides avoiding direct confrontations, made the person feel responsible for changing their opinion, which made learning much more effective. This strategy is still used by great negotiators and leaders. Instead of trying to convince someone immediately, they ask strategic questions that lead the other to see flaws in their own logic. This not only disarms conflicts, but also leads people to the correct conclusions on their own. This is much more powerful than simply telling them what to think. Steve Jobs was not a man of many words. He knew that in negotiations and presentations, silence was his greatest weapon. When he wanted his team or partners to make a decision, he would pause and wait for the discomfort of silence. This forced others to fill the space, often giving him the idea he wanted to impose. Jobs' strategic silence created tension and expectation. When he finally spoke, his words had weight. He controlled the rhythm of conversations and used calculated pauses to force his listeners to reflect. This skill not only helped him build Apple, but also made him one of the most influential figures in the corporate world. The legendary samurai Miyamoto Musashi understood that a fight began long before the first sword was drawn. He used silence to destabilize his opponents. When challenged to a duel, he often arrived late on purpose, forcing the enemy to wait and consuming them with anxiety. This psychological game undermined the opponent's confidence before the fight even started. Musashi also adopted a minimalist combat style. He didn't waste energy on unnecessary strikes. Instead, he studied the enemy's movements, waited for a gap, and attacked at the exact moment. His absolute self-control made him one of the greatest warriors in history. The principle behind these stories is clear. The one who controls silence controls the situation. In debates, negotiations, or even battles, The one who remains calm and uses strategic pauses gains an advantage. This leads us to an important question. Why do so many people fail to use this technique? The answer lies in the psychology of reactivity. If silence is such a powerful weapon, why do most people feel the need to fill every space with words? The answer is in human psychology. Our minds are programmed to react impulsively to external stimuli, especially when we feel challenged. This happens because arguing, for the brain, is not just an exchange of ideas, but a struggle for identity, control, and validation. One of the greatest obstacles to productive conversations is confirmation bias, also known as selective evidence gathering. This phenomenon makes people only look for information that reinforces their prior beliefs, ignoring any argument. When someone challenges us in a debate, we don't interpret it as an opportunity for learning, but as a threat. Our instinct, then, is to counter, defend, and reaffirm our certainties, no matter how logical the evidence presented is. This explains why most discussions don't change opinions, they just strengthen positions. Instead of dialoguing, we enter a cycle of resistance, making any argument useless. Another reason we react impulsively is because we interpret criticisms as attacks on our identity. If someone questions our political, religious, or moral beliefs, we don't see it just as a disagreement of ideas, but as a personal attack. This activates the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for emotional responses, provoking defensive and aggressive reactions. This phenomenon explains why many discussions spiral out of control. Instead of remaining calm, we are dominated by the need to protect what we believe ourselves to be. Silence, in this context, is an act of strength because it shows that you don't need to defend yourself from everything. You have control over yourself. Many people believe that by speaking louder or imposing their opinions, they are gaining influence. But true control is not in dominating the other, but in mastering your own reaction. The one who feels the need to respond to everything is actually being guided by the environment. Think about the great leaders and strategists in history. They were rarely those who spoke the most, but those who knew how to listen, observe, and act at the right moment. Strategic silence is not a sign of weakness, but an indication of psychological maturity. If we want to gain more power in our interactions, we first need to learn how to control our reactivity. And for this, the next step is understanding how to apply strategic silence in everyday life. Knowing that silence is a powerful tool is one thing, but how to put it into practice in daily life is the secret. It's in 3 fundamental techniques: using silence as a response, controlling your nonverbal communication, and employing pauses to create tension. The first principle is simple: respond with silence. When someone provokes you, instead of reacting automatically, stay silent for a few seconds. This will not only make the other person question themselves, but it will give them space to calm down. In fact, many times, silence creates the feeling that something important is about to be said, which can generate more attention. Strategic silence is a tool that we can all learn to master. It's not about shutting up for the sake of it, but using it wisely to take control of situations and generate powerful influence without having to resort to constant words. As we gain self-control and understand how to use silence in our daily lives, we become more strategic and therefore more effective. In a world where everyone tries to impose themselves with noise, those who master silence end up winning the true battle, influence over themselves and others. The next time you face a discussion, remember that sometimes the greatest power lies in what you don't say.